Thanks for tuning in to Hour 2 of On the Block Radio with Andrew Gurevich. We're glad you're back.
Folks, welcome back to the program. This is your host, Andy Gurevich. We are speaking with Stephan Schwartz, and when we left, we were just starting to get into some of the implications of what came. So you spent 4 years reading the material, Edgar Cayce's material, these case studies, and that put in you, as you said, this lifelong curiosity to study the nature of consciousness. And so what came next? Was from there, did you go help start the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness, or did the remote viewing stuff come next?
Well, no, I started the remote viewing, or was what I called distant viewing at that point.
Okay.
The term remote viewing was coined by a New York artist named Ingo Swann, who was working with the SRI lab. But I started back in Virginia. I actually staked out a grid on my back garden, and I would bury things in the grid and then give people a piece of paper that had the grid drawn out on it. And the first question I would ask them would be, can you locate the square where whatever the target is buried? And then I would ask them, I would put these things in mason jars and film canisters. And then I would say, okay, I want you to, once you've located where you think it is, I want you to describe for me the sense impressions that come to you about it, and people would do it. And I was asking everybody I knew, to try this out. And I realized that not everybody was successful all the time, of course, but that to a statistically significant level, they were significant.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was very hard to explain by chance that someone would be able to describe, for instance, one example was I put a hairbrush in a mason jar and buried it, and they not only got the right square, there were 12 squares each way, so 144 squares. So there was lots of, that if you could pick one out of 144, 1 out of 20 would be significant.
Yeah.
But in any case, so then, okay, they get the right square, and then I said, well, what is at that location? And they would say, well, I see there's a lot of glass, and there's a kind of a bottle. And I would say, okay, does the bottle contain anything? And well, yes, it's got this kind of thing. It's kind of a square shape, and it's got lots of bristles, and it's black, and the bristles are black. And now they wouldn't get that it was a hairbrush and I didn't ask them to do that, because that would be analysis, and what you're trying to get is just sense impressions.
Wow.
But then they would do it, and I would do this over and over again. I must have done a couple of hundred of these. And by that point, I realized that this distance didn't matter. It was just as easy to describe something at a distance as it was close up, and it didn't matter. I could get them to describe it. If I'd already buried it, or if I was actually discovered, if I could discover it, even if I was going to bury it or have somebody else bury it, so that I wouldn't know where it was. In any case, I just began to think about, well, what could you do with this?
Yeah.
And my initial thought was black holes were just beginning to be discussed, and I thought, well, I could get people to locate black holes. But then I talked to a friend of mine who was an astronomer, and he said that's never going to happen, because there are only a few instruments, and there are many astronomers and astrophysicists, and nobody's going to give up his time he's waited 3 years for
right.
in order to give you part of his time to see if your cockamamie scheme would work. So that ain't going to happen.
Right.
So then I thought, well, what else could I do? And about that time, I read a story about a peasant with a cart who was going along a country pathway in China, and the cart broke through, and underneath it was this tomb, and which turned out to be very important. And it was just a serendipitous discovery, and that got me to reading about archaeology, and and I looked at it, and it was clear that this is in the late '60s, that it was clear that much of archaeological discovery was based on serendipity. People just got lucky. You know, they were digging a road, or
like the Bedouin kid who found the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah,
same thing.
Yeah, it was like the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was, a kid chucking a rock in a cave mouth. And so I thought, well, I wonder if we could use this ability to locate things. And if we could, well, that would be proof of the reality of it, because everybody agrees that nobody knew where it was.
Right.
And therefore, if you could correctly describe not only the location, but what was there at that location, you could give descriptive material. And I developed a technique for analyzing it concept by concept, so that if I said, the bearded man sitting at his desk talking into a microphone, well, that's only one sentence. But bearded man, sitting, desk, microphone, that's 5 different concepts.
Yeah.
And so if you could rate each concept for accuracy, correct, partially correct, can't be evaluated, incorrect, you could begin to develop statistical profiles of how people perform these kind of tasks. And so that's really what began it all. And I started doing, once I settled on the archaeology part, I thought, well, I'll write a book about all the research that's been done up to my beginning to experiment.
Okay.
And that became a book called The Secret Vaults of Time.
Okay.
And then, I was living in Virginia Beach, and I got married, and after a couple of years, my wife got pregnant, and I needed to make more money because I felt, I had a family now, and so I went back to Washington, which was the only city that I had any connections in, really, large city, and I was hired to become the editor of a magazine called Sea Power, which was about military and maritime affairs, and that in turn led me to be asked to be the special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations, a man named Elmo Zumwalt, and the whole transformation of the military from a elitist conscription organization to an all-volunteer meritocracy. And my job was to explain it to people, what we were doing and why we were doing it. And so I wrote op-ed pieces in the New York Times, and I wrote congressional speeches and testimony and all kinds of things and presentations to other people. And beginning I started that in 1970.
Right.
In 1971, when I was starting the research for doing Secret Vaults of Time, I met a young anthropologist, a professor of anthropology at Plymouth State in New Hampshire, who was similarly interested in consciousness, and we just liked each other. A man named Joe Long, and so in 73, Joe and I began talking about trying to see whether we could get people who were interested in parapsychology to talk to people who were interested in anthropology.
If I'm not mistaken, weren't you in a little hotel in Central California somewhere?
Well, no, in Mexico City.
In Mexico City. Oh, okay. No, not even close.
So we put together what became the first panel on anthropology and parapsychology. It was called the Rhine-Swanton Symposium. And we submitted it to the American Anthropological Association for their 1973 meetings in Mexico City.
City.
And so we had gone through everybody that I had been reading about and that Joe had been reading about, and a lot of them, some of them, not all of them, but some of them I had met because I was at that, before I went back up to Washington, I had been making my living writing pieces for magazines and newspapers about various speakers that had come to the ARE, the Cayce Foundation, and so I had met a number of these people because they'd come in to give talks.
Sure.
And Joe had met some of them because of other conferences, or we just read about them. Anyway, we asked them all to come down to Mexico City and present these papers and this symposium. And this was just when Carlos Castaneda was really taking off. And it's hard to understand today because so much of it has just been incorporated into anthropology that it's just the norm. But at the time, what Castaneda was saying was unspeakably radical and caused enormous distress in anthropology.
And what he was saying was that a phenomena cannot be fully understood unless empirically, unless it's experienced, which was flies in the face of academic.
He said you cannot understand the shaman's path until you walk the shaman's path. Mm-hmm. You can't stand objective to it and really understand it. And also at this same point, Charles Tart, who was a young professor of psychology at the University of California, had published in Science a paper on altered states, state-specific science, in which he had argued that basically the same thing Castaneda was arguing, only in a more scientific way. Charlie's argument was you really have got to have the experience of the altered state in order to understand the altered state. And so the combination
which
of
was something that Leary was arguing in his Harvard work before he kind of went a little bit off the rails.
Yeah, but he wasn't really yes, he was, and so Leary was doing that, and also John Lilly had begun thinking about this, but they were not really factors. The big factor, Castaneda, because he went back and got a doctorate in anthropology,
which UCLA didn't want to give him until the books took off.
Yeah, well, actually, he didn't get it from UCLA; he got it from Berkeley.
Oh, really? And, fascinating.
And he, but in any case, what he was saying, first in a book called The Yucky Way of Knowledge, and then another one called The Journey of Ixtlan, and then I've forgotten what the third one was called, but the first three books are the critical ones.
The critical ones, I agree.
And I got to know Castaneda later, but anyway, he had written these books arguing that the whole presumption of anthropology, that you could be independent of the thing that you were studying and really understand the inside of it, was simply wrong.
Huh.
And that was incredibly challenging to a lot of anthropologists. I mean, at the Rhine-Swanton symposium that we put on, Norman Emerson, who was the chairman of the Department of Anthropology at University of Toronto, and Anton Barati, who was the chairman of anthropology at the University of Syracuse, or Syracuse University, after Emerson presented, Barati stood up. I mean, it was amazing stuff to see at an academic meeting.
Yeah. And
shook his fist at Emerson and said, "You're either lying or cheating, because what you're saying cannot possibly be true."
Now, isn't this something physicists, you bring up Max Planck, I mean, it seems like, Heisenberg and others, Planck had been saying for a while that observer and observed exist in this connected web of perception that is not as clean as the objectivity in science had been laying out in the other fields.
Yes, and in fact, American anthropology, all of this traces back to, in modern times, you go back to Plotinus and earlier, but in any case, Empedocles and the pre-Socratic philosopher. But in any case, in modern times, this really gets started with a man named Adolf Bastian, who is a polymath in Germany, and who had an enormous influence on the German school of physics. That's Planck, Pauli, Heisenberg, Schrodinger, Einstein, had a big effect on these guys. And he talked about what he called the elementary thoughts of humanity. There's a German word for it, which I never pronounced.
Elementargedanken, is the word.
Yeah, Elementargedanken. So that had a big effect on German physicists, and it also had a big effect on Franz Boas, who was the father of American anthropology.
Absolutely.
And all of whom were struck by this. Jung, out of Bastian's work, Jung developed the concept of the collective unconscious,
which Joseph Campbell took as well.
Which Joseph Campbell then makes into the monomyth.
Right. Bastian was very influential to Campbell's work as well.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Exactly. So there was this whole thread in anthropology. Plus, this man, John Reed Swanton, who was a tremendously powerful, outside of anthropology, people don't know him anymore. But, this man was a tremendous pioneer in anthropology. When he retired, the Smithsonian published a special monograph just on his work.
Wow.
So John Reed Swanton had written a letter, an open letter to anthropology in I think it was the late 50s, or the early 50s, 52, 53, as I remember. I'm doing this out of memory.
Sure.
Swanton had written an open letter to anthropology saying, in a related discipline, parapsychology, there is research that is going on that is directly addressing the kinds of cultural things that about consciousness that anthropologists are concerned with, and that anthropology ought to be opening itself up to considering what this research is suggesting to us. And that letter, the John Reed Swanton letter, is what gave Joe Long and I the idea and gave us the critical justification for the American Anthropological Association to start the Reed Swanton, the Rhine Swanton...
the panel in Mexico City.
The panel that we did in Mexico City. We went to the AAA, and we said to them, look, here's one of the leading people in anthropology who's saying this, and so here's a panel that's doing what he says we ought to be doing. And it was on that basis that they said, well, okay, all right, you can do this. So we did this panel down in Mexico City, which, people were screaming and yelling and thrashing around. Fist fights in the hallways. It was really quite amazing to see this stress that was being created by this idea, both by Castaneda and then by what we were doing, that consciousness had to be considered in the study of anthropology, that it was not just some byproduct of biochemistry, and that there was also a very real body of evidence, ethnohistorically, that consciousness survived corporeal death.
I think this is really fascinating, and we're going to go to another break here, and so I want to push this over to after the break. But what you're talking about is really, you were present and really helped initiate, because the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness was born out of this, correct?
Yes. Well, what finally happened was Joe and I invited Norm Emerson to go out to dinner, because he was the father of Canadian archaeology, and he was a very serious guy in Canada, and he was openly talking about using a remote viewer named George McMullen to do exploration. And one of his graduate students, a fellow named C.S. Reed, had used McMullen to locate two Iroquois villages using remote viewing that had saved his degree because he wasn't going to get it. He had been unable to find anything for years of work, and George found it all in about a half an hour.
Wow.
So, and Emerson talked about it. He was willing to openly talk about it, and he was so senior that he provided an umbrella in Canada under which younger people could sort of hover, because his prestige and status gave them some protection.
Kind of a leaky
so we
figure.
asked him to go out to dinner with us, and at that dinner, and then we went back to our hotel room, my hotel room, we decided we would start what has become the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness.
And these are anthropologists who do exactly what you're saying, who study the nature of consciousness. And this meeting you're at in Mexico City is really nothing short, and when we look back on it, of kind of the birthplace of a Kuhnian revolution, right? The Thomas Kuhn, the nature, structure of scientific paradigms. I'm butchering the name of the book.
Well, yes.
But that's what's occurring
here. I
here.
had read Thomas Kuhn.
Yeah.
Thomas Kuhn had published a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution.
Revolutions, that's the word, yes.
Yes, which is, I think, arguably the most important book on the sociology and psychology of science written in the 20th century.
I
and
agree.
It's generally recognized by that. I mean, Kuhn is a kind of an Olympian figure. He was at the Princeton Center for Advanced Studies, and he wrote this seminal book, and people teach courses now on Thomas Kuhn.
Mm-hmm.
And I had read it, and Kuhn describes this process of insight that he says big breakthroughs in science don't come by careful reasoning. They come by these leaps of faith and inspiration in which people suddenly have these aha moments. And, of course, Einstein says exactly that. And as I began to do research, so do creative people like Brahms and Beethoven, and so do famous artists, and also so do famous shamans and mystics.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized all these people were talking about the same experience. They were just talking about it in a different context. Scientists tend to see the things that they want, which is insights into the science, the process of how things work.
And materiality, yeah.
Yeah, creative people are, want to see, they want to hear, create symphonies or create great paintings or sculptures or things like that. And spiritual pilgrims and mystics and shamans want to have a deeper knowledge or a deeper understanding experience of the non-local unity, whatever they call it. But they all describe this experience in exactly the same way. And
yeah, it's
so
the nature of consciousness, and it's really, they're all studying the nature of transformations as well.
Yes, and
one form or
and
another.
this aspect of consciousness which is non-local.
Right.
And so the whole idea behind the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness, and it's worked out very well, is that this a long time ago, that this started in 73, so I mean, we're now 30 years later, more than 30 years later, we see that it has become a part of anthropology. And today, the idea that you could study and understand a culture, or that you could understand shamanism by just talking to informants, would be laughable. I mean, today, young anthropologists would say, well, of course, you have to understand the shamanic experience to understand why shamans think as they do. But trust me, in 1973, that was unbelievably
radical
radical.
idea. It completely changed our understanding of praxis as well. That's fascinating. All right, so we're going to go to break. We're going to conclude this section of the program, and when we come back, I want to ask you just a couple of more questions about remote viewing. I want to talk about the Alexandria Project and what happened in Egypt, a little bit about the Mobius Institute, and then I want to actually, you've been alluding to it this whole time, I want to get into the discussion of the nature of consciousness and what you found in your work with regard to that, and a couple other questions for you, and then we'll talk about the new book. Does that sound good?
Okay.
Great, Stephen. Thank you so much. Folks, you're listening to On the Block Radio. This is your host, Andy Gurvich. Our guest has been Stephan Schwartz, and we'll be back after this.
It's On the Block Radio with Andrew Gurvich. Okay, just Gurvich? Okay. So do I address them? Like, do I say, like, you're listening to On the Block
You just say
Radio?
you're talking to the audience.
This is Shantae Orion, and you're listening to On the Block Radio with Andrew Gurevich. Let me do that again. Now, I was so focused on the last name that I started to skip right over your first name. This is Shantae Orion, and you're listening to me murder Andrew Gurevich's last name on the Block Radio.
How can I help my daughter with her reading?
Searching for help with Dachshund breeding.
How can I help my daughter with her reading?
Information on hot water heating.
No. Sarah's bright, but when she's reading, she has trouble sounding out the words.
World music, playing track now.
No.
Let me try. Our daughter gets confused about which details in a story are important.
Which paper towels are most absorbent?
What?
Here are 5 product reviews.
Why are you not getting me?
See, I told you.
Wait, I was trying to show you how Sarah feels every day. Frustrating, isn't it? Redirecting to understood.org.
For the 1 in 5 kids with learning and attention issues, this is what life can feel like. Explore understood.org, a free online resource about learning and attention issues, designed to help your child thrive in school and in life. Understood.org, because understanding is everything.
Brought to you by understood.org and the Ad Council.
Welcome back to the program, folks. This is Andy Gurevich. We're speaking with Stephan Schwartz. And when we left, you were telling us about the time in Mexico City and the founding of the Society of the Anthropology of Consciousness. And I just wanted to return a little bit to your work in remote viewing experiments and ask about the Mobius Institute and what that was and the founding of it and the work it did. And then also about you alluded to it, but the using remote viewing in archaeology and what happened with you in Egypt, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, well, to pick up the story, so now we're in 1973, and we come back from the Mexico meetings. Joe and I very excited. Norm Emerson has gotten on board. Mm-hmm. I'm doing research for what becomes the Secret Vaults of Time, while at the same time I'm working as the special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations. And then Watergate happens. And Watergate was very difficult for me because I knew most of the players.
Wow.
And I worked with them, and I got to a point where I realized I could not tell the good guys from the bad guys. And I went home and said to my wife, we got to get out of here.
So you knew guys like Chuck Colson and Halderman and these folks?
Yeah, and Howard Hunt, and
yeah.
All of them.
Wow.
Right. So, I mean, it was very difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, Richard Nixon was a criminal. Mm-hmm. And it was obvious he was a criminal. And it's all, I mean, now Watergate, it all seems, very historical, but I tell you, Watergate for me sort of centers down to one thing. I in those days, I used to have lunch in the Secretary of the Navy's mess. Behind a secret door on the E-ring of the Pentagon is a restaurant that is called, each service secretary has one, but in the Navy, it's across the hall, and it's a secret door you can't see, and behind it is this restaurant called the Secretary of the Navy's Mess, where senior officers and staff have lunch. And I went in there one day, quite late in the day, because they stopped serving, and I went in, and there was nobody else in the room but the Deputy Commandant of the Marine Corps, who I will allow to be nameless here, and who was someone that I knew and liked a lot. He was a very nice guy. And he was sitting there all by himself with his back to me, and his back was kind of shaking. And I went over to say hello to him, and I realized he was crying. Very quietly, just sort of, but sobbing. I mean, he was just really in enormous distress.
Wow.
And I went over to him and said, are you okay? I mean, is there something I can do? And he said to me, I have served my country for almost 30 years. I have never disobeyed an order. I have been willing to order men to go to their almost certain death to achieve a goal, but I do not know what to do now. If I am ordered to place the city of Washington, D.C. under martial law, I don't know that I can accept that order.
Wow.
And now nobody talks about this much anymore, but at that time, John Mitchell, who was the Attorney General of the United States, was seriously considering placing Washington, D.C. under martial law.
Wow.
And, I mean, it didn't happen, of course, but here was the Deputy Commandant of the Marine Corps, who would have been one of the people involved with that.
This is really the kind of thing not to...
was... What?
Oh, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was going to say it's the kind of thing Smedley Butler warned everybody about that was coming.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that was very much in his mind.
Yeah.
I sat down and we had lunch, and that was exactly what he had in mind.
Wow.
Smedley Butler was what he was thinking about. Now, people don't know Smedley Butler. A group of veterans came to Washington, and they camped out on the mall, and the question was, were they going to be suppressed by a military force?
Yeah.
This man was in existential distress.
Wow.
And I got it. I mean, we sat there and talked through it and had lunch, and he was a man in existential distress that was so great that he was just barely keeping himself under control. It was an extraordinary experience to witness and be part of. And I came home from that and went home and said to my wife, I really don't think we can stay here. I don't know what's going on. Now, in fact, I did stay. Zumwalt left, and Jim Holloway became the CNO after him, and he asked me to stay on for about 6 months. But I decided
the writing was on the wall at that
point. I would leave government.
Yeah.
I mean, I was offered, other things were available to me, but I decided I just didn't want to do that. And so I decided I would go to Tucson, Arizona, and I would complete what became the Secret Vaults of Time, and I would do an archaeological project involving the talking idol of Ixchel on Cozumel Island in Mexico, and to see if we could locate this talking idol, and we did, and the book came out, and the question that arose when I had been in the Navy, although I was a civilian, but as special assistant, friends in the CIA had been sending me translations of what were then classified documents by a man named Leonid Vasiliev, who was a physiologist who was working in those days Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. And he had been asked by the Soviet government the question, is this aspect of consciousness electromagnetic? And he had been doing experiments to test that hypothesis, and he was a very methodical researcher.
So the same way pigeons use like echolocation to find their way, right? Like something to do with the electromagnetic field of the Earth?
Well, no, what he was doing was putting people down in caves and in mine shafts and in Faraday cages inside of caves, and he was very methodically filtering out each aspect of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Okay.
And so he got it down. He got it down to one question. And he published these papers, and so they were sending me these papers, which I was reading in translation from this Russian guy. And he finally said, I've eliminated every aspect of EM, electromagnetic radiation, except for ELF, 300 to 300 hertz. And because I can't shield for that, because of the nature of the ELF waveform, the only thing that can shield from it is the ocean. And he had gone apparently to, this is the story, he had gone to Admiral Gorshkov, who was the father of the Soviet nuclear navy, the Blue Water Navy, and had tried to put a sailor into a submarine, but was unable to do so. And so, at the time that I read this, I happened to be flying up on the Secretary of the Navy's plane up to Groton, Connecticut, to launch christen a nuclear submarine, and on the plane was Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the American nuclear fleet.
Wow.
And I asked Rickover if I could get a couple of sailor volunteers and myself and go out on one of the boomers, these deep ocean ballistic missile submarines, to see if I could do this remote viewing experiment that Vasilyev had talked about but had been unable to do. And he thought about it and said, well, I'll get back to you. And a week or so later, he called me up and said, it's a very interesting experiment, but I'm not going to do it because if I did, William Proxmire, senator from Wisconsin, would give me the golden fleece, which he was then giving out for wasted government money.
Yeah, of course.
And I just don't need the aggravation, so I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it. So it didn't look like it was ever going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I went out to Arizona and I wrote Secret Vaults, and Joe Long and I began holding meetings of what was then called something different, but now the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness.
Uh-huh.
And we decided we would hold another panel in 1978. But in 77, just as I was finishing the book, I was invited to come out to the Philosophical Research Society and was offered a senior fellowship there. And I stayed when I was visiting in Los Angeles with John Keach, who he had just retired, who had been the deputy director of Navy Labs and had been the officer who had found the hydrogen bomb lost off Palermo.
Wow.
Using a deep submersible called the Alvin. And his best friend was a guy named Don Walsh, who had made the deepest dive in history that's ever going to be made in the Challenger Deep of the Mariana Trench.
Oh, wow.
And in a thing called Trieste with Auguste Piccard and a French explorer who had created this bath escape that they then lowered to the bottom of the sea,
wow,
in the deepest point of the sea.
Mm-hmm.
So Don Walsh and Don Keach were both experts in deep ocean engineering, and while I was staying with Keach, he said to me, we've got everybody knew I wanted to do this experiment. He said, we've got a submarine that's coming out to do its sea trials, and we would be willing to give you 3 days of the submarine to test your hypothesis.
Wow.
Which was a huge gift.
Yeah, my God.
Bowled over. A submarine, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I thought, oh, well, this is great. So I designed what then became known as the Deep Quest Project, which was to see if, first of all, could remote viewers reach into the sea and locate a previously unknown wreck on the sea floor, and second of all, could I put them in the submarine and ask them to locate where people were hiding somewhere in the United States. And I knew exactly how deep I had to go, because beginning in about 1970, the Navy had begun a project called Project Sanguine, and later became known as Project ELF, in which they had determined that the use of ELF was the best way to communicate with the boomers. If you saw the movie The Quest for Red October,
yeah,
you remember the scene where they get the message while they're submerged, and it's just a couple of numbers, but then you open a book up and those couple of numbers mean something else.
Sure.
They have an associated meaning.
Right.
And when I had been writing a speech for Zumwalt, and I was doing research on looking for a historical example of what I was trying to say, I had come across the Battle of Abu Qir Bay, where Admiral Lord Nelson had defeated, the English admiral had defeated Napoleon's admiral, Admiral Brueys, in this famous battle called the Battle of Abu Qir, and which is up on the top of the African coastline, the African littoral, a little bit east of Alexandria, Egypt, and where his flagship had been blown up. It was a battle that was so decisive that from that point forward, the French were never really a competitive naval force. So this is in Navy terms or in maritime history, this is a very big deal.
Yeah.
And in doing this, in order to communicate with his ships, Nelson had used a process where he would fly colored flags, because the ships were so spread out they couldn't, in the smoke of the black powder from the cannon, you couldn't see very far, the visibility wasn't good. So he had his frigates, smaller ships, sail up and down, flying these flags, and the flags held associated meanings.
Okay.
And I thought, well, I'll do the same thing. I'll have people, I'll associate particular targets with particular outcomes, and if people can successfully remote view them while they are submerged, then that associated value will show that you can use it for communications. And and I knew exactly how deep you had to get, because this Project ELF, Project Sanguine, the Navy had determined exactly how deep ELF penetrated.
Oh, so you went below that.
So all I had to do was go below that, which I did. And a researcher by the name of Michael Persinger up in Canada, in 1973, he had written a paper arguing that if non-local consciousness was electromagnetic, then it must almost certainly be ELF, because only ELF could explain the observed phenomena.
Right.
And so I had Persinger on one side, and I had the Navy's ELF Sanguine project, knowing how deep to go, and then I had Vasiliev. So I thought, well, if I go deeper, then ELF can penetrate, and yet people can still perform just as they had done in Vasiliev's experiments. They didn't make any difference. Shielding was irrelevant.
Right.
Then I would be able to definitively demonstrate that non-local consciousness was not electromagnetic, that there was not a signal, that nobody was sending something. We are not walkie-talkies.
Right.
And so we had the 3 days, and at the last minute, I invited the SRI guys who were running the secret military CIA lab. If they wanted to get involved, I had just met Ingo Swan and Hella Hammond and Ed May and Russell Targ and Al Putoff, who were at that lab, and so we went down, and first we put Ingo into the submarine and asked him to find where Russell and Hal were hiding in Palo Alto, and he was successfully able to do that. And then we took him out and put Hella in, and she was successfully able to do it. They went to another place, and it worked again. And also, I used George McMullen from Norman Emerson and a bunch of other people, Alan Vaughn, that I had met, and they were successfully able to locate this ship and to describe why it was there and what would be found there, how it had gotten there, how old it was, what had led to its sinking. I mean, just hundreds and hundreds of details, not all of which, but the great majority of which turned out to be correct.
That's amazing.
And we made a film out of it, and anybody who's interested can go up to YouTube and just search on Deep Quest, and you can actually watch it happen.
That's amazing. And what was the response to that? I mean, when you did that experiment?
Well, the response to it was, for people who knew what was really involved was great interest. There was an enormous amount of popular interest. I sold it. It was on we made a television show out of it. And I got Leonard Nimoy to do the narration. So that was very popular. In science, it made people's hair stand up, and it was very challenging.
Because it didn't fit the accepted paradigm, yeah.
Yeah, for the materialists, the physicalists, they would just prefer to ignore it. For those who were willing to actually look at the data, they were confronted with the reality that this aspect of consciousness is not electromagnetic. We're not walkie-talkies, which was what, the word telepathy was coined in 1887 by Frederick Meyer, and he was friends with most of the people who were doing the early electromagnetic research, and they were involved with telephonics and telegraphy, and in 1873, the first telegraph from Bombay to London opened up, and so everybody was very involved with sort of electromagnetic communication. Crookes, the father who discovered the cathode ray tube. So Myers was friends with all these early consciousness researchers, and they came to think of it as another form of a kind of radio communication.
Right.
And telepathy, like telegraphy, telephony, telepathy.
Okay.
And so for most of the first half of the 20th century, if people thought about it, and lots of people didn't, but even those who did, the general assumption was, well, it must be there's some kind of sender and receiver. And if you read the old parapsychological literature, they talk about senders and receivers and signals and all of this sort of electromagnetic analogy stuff. But it turns out, with the Deep Quest experiment, it became clear that simply was not a sustainable explanation.
Well, and that's fascinating. And let's ask you this here. I do want to cycle back in a second and talk about what happened in Egypt. But you've been alluding and using some terms about the nature of consciousness that I want to just talk about for a second for many of our listeners that may not be familiar with these terms. And you keep talking about consciousness as non-local and immaterial. And I think we can get our heads around the idea that there's a certain camp of researchers that believe what consciousness is, as I've said, an emergent property, something that emerges out of inanimate matter at a certain level of complexity, right? So single-cell organisms evolve into more complex organisms, and then at some point that bag of skin emerges as conscious, and so that's what consciousness is a physical property, a physical emergent property of the material universe.
Right. That was the dominant paradigm.
Right. And so now there's another set of researchers, beginning with yourself and others, in many fields, now including physicists, not now including, I mean, maybe even starting with physicists, but again, the great quantum revolution, that are suggesting that consciousness, that the data is showing us that consciousness is not local, which means it doesn't originate within the individual, and that it is not material, right? Is that what you're suggesting the data is saying?
Yes, exactly. But I am a Planckian.
Okay.
In 1931, Max Planck gave an interview to The Observer in which they said to him, basically, what have you learned? I mean, he was at that time one of the most famous people in the world. He was one of the great Olympian physicists, father of quantum mechanics, blah, 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 right?
Mm-hmm.
So they took him out and interviewed him, and this was at a time when an interview in a newspaper like The Observer was a very big deal. I mean, and they knew it was a big deal. So the statement he made, he quite understood was a public statement. And he said, in answer to what do you learn, he said, well, what I've learned is that consciousness is fundamental, and that space-time is its manifestation.
Wow.
You cannot get behind consciousness because consciousness is the ground fundamental. And then in 1944, 3 years before he died, he gave a speech in Italy, and he was basically asked the same thing. And he said, well, as a man who has spent his entire life studying atoms, I'm sorry to tell you that at the most fundamental and ultimate level, they don't exist. That consciousness is what we should be focused on.
That's amazing.
And so that, and Planck and Pauli and Schrödinger and Heisenberg and Einstein, Einstein calls it the optical delusion of space-time.
Yeah.
And so it began really with physicists, at least in the modern sense, and has now become, in a variety of disciplines from physics to medicine to biology, everything from near-death studies to quantum biology. We now have a growing number of researchers who don't start out from the point of view that consciousness is anything other than a physical emergent property. I mean, they start out as materialists, but the data of their own research compels them to address the issue of consciousness as being fundamental.
And
I think that is the emerging paradigm.
You just sort of answered one of my questions a second ago, because one of the questions I was going to ask you is, how is the argument for this non-local consciousness or immateriality, as you're talking about, differ from sort of traditional faith in the supernatural or in God? Because I know you to be a numbers guy. A lot of the stuff we're talking about really exists out on the margins, but as I've seen you speak and read your writings over the years, you kind of return people to the idea that you're a data person. You're not interested in exploring, these notions of kind of woo-woo New Age dogma, but you're actually looking at where the data takes you. And I think
I'm a data guy. I mean, if the data said you were animated meat, that's it, dead meat, no consciousness. Well, I mean, I might find that aesthetically unappealing, but I would accept it. If that's what the data said, that's what the data says.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't what the data says. The data says something quite different. And when the denier argument about consciousness is very much like the denier argument about evolution or climate change. It's really a false equivalency argument. On one side, you have a group of people, some of whom are very prominent, who are arguing that the animated meat argument.
Yes.
And but they don't actually bother to read the actual research. They just dismiss it. Well, it can't possibly be true because, it can't possibly be true.
Right.
And then on the other side, you have the people like me and who are data people. And my interpretation, by the way, of what we mean by New Agey or all that sort of thing, metaphysical, is that those are simply attempts that people make to develop a culturally relevant explanation for experiences that they've had. I mean, if you think about it...
Yeah, that's a good point.
Every religion begins with the non-local consciousness experiences of a single person. Whether it's the Buddha or Jesus or Muhammad or Lao Tzu or Patanjali, I mean, whomever you like, all of it begins, a single individual has a non-local consciousness experience. And they explain the experience to other people. And whatever it is they say is sufficiently compelling that a group of followers grow up around this person's personal experiences. And they focus on the person as the leader, but they're really focused on the fact that this person has had a non-local experience. That's what makes them compelling. And out of that comes religion, and with its dogmas and structures and priesthoods and all the rest of it. But at its core, it all starts with a single individual having a non-local consciousness experience. So it's like genius. Genius is an individual experience, but its importance only occurs when there is social acceptance.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true of religion. I mean, Moses could have come down from the mountain with the tablets and said, we got a problem, and they all could have said, well, he's a crazy old man, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Or the same thing with Jesus or Buddha or, whatever. It's the fact that it is a single person having an experience which then finds collective acceptance. And so once you get that, then the language in which people who are studying this person's experience and who are trying to replicate it in their own lives, all of the language that they develop is all their cultural construct that is their attempt to try to explain, particularly in a pre-scientific period. I mean, when we say spiritual, what we really mean is non-local consciousness.
Right.
But until the whole idea of consciousness really became, as an independent thing that could be studied, became a reality, there wasn't. I mean, spiritual was the only way you could describe it in a pre-scientific world. That was the way you described it. The gods were speaking to me. God was speaking to me.
Absolutely.
The Great Mother was speaking to me. The earth spirits were speaking to me. Whatever. That was the only context in which people could integrate this into their lives, and so they called it spiritual, and then out of spiritual comes religion. So you can say the syllogism is all religions have a component of spirituality, but all spirituality is not religious.
Yeah, that's absolutely important. And if you can you stick with us through one more break, and then we'll finish up?
Sure.
Yeah, because I have two questions for you relating to what you just said, and one of them dovetails exactly into the new book. And so we will get into that to finish the program. Does that work for you?
Sure.
All right, folks, you've been listening to On the Block Radio. We appreciate you sticking with us. We'll be back after these messages.
The conversation continues with our guest, Stephan Schwartz. Join us for the third hour of OTB Radio.